Is it okay now? Okay, good. So as I have said, Ukrainian elections are always democratic and always unpredictable. So in contrast to what we have in Russia, we never can predict who will be Ukrainian president, and you may invest a lot of administrative resource, financial resources, media control, but at the end of the day, it appears that it's the will of Ukrainian electors who will become the president. In these elections, we have very actually peculiar situation because we didn't know who will be finally in the runoff. There were 3 candidates. Usually we have 2 leading candidates, so we know who is in the runoff. We do not know who will be finally elected, but at least 2 names are known more or less in advance. In this situation, there were 3 main candidates. Now we have results, so we know who is in the runoff. And first I would like to start with the phenomenon of Mr. Zelensky. It can be explained by a protest vote. So this is actually a protest vote against all the politicians. There is a distrust towards politicians who are in power, who are in opposition. And this can be explained by the situation in which the country is. A lot of things happened after Revolution of Dignity and the start of Russian aggression. The main thing is that Ukraine survived. Ukraine signed association agreement, visa-free regime with the EU. There are international sanctions against Russia. So basically, if we assess the policy of the current president, in the foreign policy and security policy, it's more or less positive. However, and also, the reform started in other spheres, including judicial and anti-corruption reform. But here, the results are very mixed. And many Ukrainians are not satisfied with this situation. You need to understand that it's very difficult to conduct radical economic reforms. Some of these reforms are not popular, especially when you need to increase the tariffs for the communal bills. And you are doing these reforms in time when you have the war, when there is a freedom of speech, when the government is criticized on every channel, president, prime minister, they are criticized on every channel, and especially it's very difficult to conduct radical reforms on the eve of elections. So there is some frustration from Ukrainian electorate who are not satisfied with the tempos and results of the reform. And this is the explanation for the protest vote for Mr. Zelensky. Again, protest vote is not unique in Ukraine. Perhaps the uniqueness of the situation is that Mr. Zelensky is a person who doesn't have any political experience, and basically I would say even any experience in the sphere of public opinion. You know that his success is mainly explained by the fact that he performed the role of president, of an honest president in a movie, which is very popular, and many people just projected the image of the actor to the image of the candidate for president. But this is explanation, and Mr. Zelensky is not involved in any discussion on specific topics of Ukrainian politics. So he is deliberately avoiding this discussion. And mostly his campaign is concentrated in social media and also on channel 1+1, which is controlled by oligarch Kolomoisky. And his main message is, I am different from all the politicians. I would be honest president. That's his main message. And we saw that this message worked in the first round. Regarding Poroshenko is making accent on what has been achieved. He stresses that he is a leader who led the country through difficult times, through the war, and he is a real commander-in-chief, and he gained successes in the diplomatic sphere. And by doing that, he also managed to mobilize a part of post-Maidan electorate. So on the one hand, you have the increase of the rating of Zelensky, but because part of the electorate is afraid of inexperience of Mr. Zelensky, it made possibility for Poroshenko also to mobilize this electorate, and that's how he gained support, enough support to move into the second round. And my prediction is basically that this line would remain in the runoff. So Poroshenko would stress that he is predictable, he provides stability, he will be a commander, a real commander-in-chief in time of war. While Zelensky would continue to perform his line of very broad, good slogans without moving into details. And actually, Ukrainian civil society is demanding open debates between the main candidates and to concentrate this debate on the spheres which are responsibility, which are constitutional responsibility of the president. And we need to understand that responsibility of Ukrainian president is actually limited. He's not all-powerful like in Russia, in Belarus, or other countries. That's why importance of parliamentary elections, which will be in the fall, is also very, very, it will be very great. So the main lines of the runoff are clear, and the question is how both candidates would be able to mobilize the electorate. Again, for Zelensky, it's important to mobilize inexperienced electorate who believes in these wonderful good slogans, while for Poroshenko it would be important to mobilize, or to make mobilization not only of his present electorate, but also to increase the base and to take part from other candidates from post-Maidan electorate. And we'll see whether these tactics would be successful. Regarding what would happen after the elections, I think that one we can be sure is the general line of Ukrainian foreign and security policy will not change, because all the main candidates, they used pro-European rhetoric. Definitely the questions of foreign policy, they were not detailed in the programs of some candidates, including Zelensky, but at least formally he's talking about also about EU choice. And moving Ukraine closer to Europe. So in case if Zelensky is elected, I believe there would be no change in, mainly no change in rhetoric, but the question is who will be behind Zelensky? So what would be his team? Who would be his real advisors in different spheres? Because as I said, he's very inexperienced, and his knowledge about politics, especially international politics, is limited, and that may be exploited by Putin, for example, who may play on this inexperience of new president if this president is Zelensky. What I would like also to stress, and this is my final point, is that previously in Ukraine we had very strict polarization of the country. For example, in elections of 2004, which led for the Orange Revolution, or 2010, West and Center voted for one candidate, East and South voted for another candidate. There was a regional polarization. In elections of 2014, there were no such polarization, because the situation changed after the revolution and with the start of the Russian aggression, because geopolitical orientation towards Russia totally collapsed. Basically, what we can see right now, definitely there would be some regional differences. For example, Poroshenko won the first place in the West. Zelensky won in other regions, especially in the south of Ukraine. In east of Ukraine, he shared the first and second place with Mr. Boyko. But in general, we see that there would be, so there would be regional specifics, but it would be not as polarizing as it was before in 2004 and 2010. And I would end here. Thank you.
Пан Олександр, Сушко, просимо до слова.
Дуже дякую.
Mr. Sushko, the floor is yours. Well, to balance Mr. Haran's speech in English, I would try to speak Ukrainian. And speaking at large, I understand that the quality of translation is good, so that our foreign guests could understand everything we say. Therefore, As of today, we have a result that has been quite predictable. Let me remind you the results of the polls, previous opinion polls preceding the voting. And by the way, shame on those who were speaking about the so-called sociology for sale in Ukraine. I mean that the sociologists had been working hard before the elections, and the results did not differ significantly from their projections. There could be a lot of interpretations to these results. Probably the complex of causes that could be defined as anti-establishment sensitivities and approaches and mood among the voters, and that is also an evidence of the failure of communication on behalf of the ruling quarters of Ukraine. Therefore, the result is an outcome of the policies of the authorities, Ukrainian authorities. They have lost significant portion of the trust of the public to them, because if the people, if the society at large does not support the government, it supports the opposition, or they support the opposition. In that case, maybe not yet supported the opposition with high result, but neither the authorities got any significant support. Therefore, that hypothesis, which has been advocated by a lot of political analysts, were discussing and putting forward about the need for the new faces in Ukrainian politics. Who are these new faces? Obviously, Mr. Zelensky was not the only one in the Ukraine political market, so to say, and this role of the new political faces have been tried by many other politicians, but many of them didn't go further than an attempt to position themselves as the new political faces, and it appeared that it was not enough to have only a new face in politics, but the need for the other qualities. Therefore, phenomenon of Mr. Zelensky is a combination of an array of factors and reasons for his popularity. First of all, certainly his name recognition, very high level of his recognition, because Mr. Zelensky has been for many years amongst the most recognizable media personalities in Ukraine. It's true that he has not been directly related in any way to public administration, but he has been related to political processes. He has been impersonating politicians on stage, theater stage, and he was criticizing them. He has been criticizing them, and that political satire to for the best, or to a larger extent or to smaller extent, because he was criticized by some of the politicians who disliked him. But again, it appealed to the feelings of a rank-and-file Ukrainian citizen, and that appeal has made him a quite popular political figure and political candidate. And we can agree here that in the person of Mr. Zelensky, we have a phenomenon of maybe politically immature societies where an actor is associated with a political personality. So a politician whom he impersonated in his TV series, that image was projected to his real personality. But on the other hand, those erred who in the last days were advocating this meme that you could see in the social media: do not vote for fun. that message practically didn't reach its goal, because the number of people who were going to vote for fund was not large at all. And generally speaking, the choice of Mr. Zelensky was done by the people who had quite serious considerations for that choice. And the fact is that maybe some people who are well versed in politics could see quite simplistic these expectations on the part of the electorate, but these expectations in the end have been associated to a person who has not been related in any measure with current Ukraine's political class at all. So for those people, an argument of the lack of experience, political experience of Mr. Zelensky's played positively. It contributed to the positive perception of Mr. Zelensky, because political experience in Ukrainian context would mean also corruption and relation to a number of political blunders and failures that have occurred in the last years. Also, not very convincing was an attempt to tie Mr. Zelensky in any respect with the interests of Russia, because frankly speaking, there have been no justification for that, no argument, valid arguments to support that attempt. And that attempt to tie him up to Mr. Kolomoisky, a prominent Ukrainian businessman. Certainly, Mr. Kolomoisky being a controversial personality, but on the other hand, we understand that both Mr. Poroshenko and Ms. Tymoshenko, for example, are also controversial and have been controversial in their actions. Therefore, the fact that Mr. Kolomoisky is controversial cannot mean that he is going to guide or to manage somehow Mr. Zelensky. People understood that. And therefore, the situation we have now is that Mr. Zelensky succeeded in, positioning himself in that social niche, if we want, of that new political phase, in Ukrainian politics. What's the outcome going to be of the runoff of the second round of elections? It's difficult now to make any projections, any predictions, but the probability of quite significant changes is very high, the probability of these changes. Thank you. I will continue in Ukrainian, and I'd be less optimistic maybe than my colleagues. The reason is, in my view, that we are trying to not to notice a number of trends that I would call define as negative. For example, the fact that 1+1 TV channel that is quite close to one of the leading Ukrainian entrepreneurs has been broadcasting a TV series which was practically contributing to the image of one of the presidential candidates. De facto, I would agree with the ideas expressed earlier that these elections are much more competitive than even those of 2014, and by the number of attempts to violate or breach electoral law, to falsify in any way any results of the vote has been much less numerous, and it's good that they haven't succeeded, these attempts, and the violations have been minor violations. Let's hope that for the second round of the elections this trend would persist, but again, the result of the first round means that for an asystemic, so to say, political candidate as Mr. Zelensky, it was beneficial not to play by the rules of Ukrainian politics. This demand of the public to have some positive candidate was Mr. Zelensky availed himself of that demand, societal demand, and the first tour has demonstrated that some optimistic slogans of Mr. Zelensky's have been also very successful in reaching and appealing to the audience. Therefore, Mr. Zelensky's so to say, action in the not in the institutional, so to say, playground traditional for the other candidates. The other candidates try to use these institutions to their benefit, and Mr. Zelensky appealed to the abilities, to the broader participation of the citizens, asking them to win over these negative, institutionalized ways and means of Ukrainian politics. Therefore, we can say that these non-traditional, non-orthodox, unorthodox ways could successfully be used in the media space of Ukraine. And if we speak about the other candidates, they were trying to create some networks of the people who were trying to promote them. And their efficiency, might be said, was higher than before. But at the same time, also the responsibility for the violation of electoral law. The previously occurring violations of the law, they were going unpunished under the previous government, and that contributed to the negative outcome for them over that first tour of the elections. When, for example, the Minister of the Interior and the head of the Security Service of Ukraine, they were speaking at length about their efforts to prevent possible violations of electoral law on the eve of the elections. And whether the public believed them or not remains unclear, but as we can see from Mr. Zelensky's success, his direct appeal to the voters has been more successful. At the same time, I would like to say that there have been a lot of gaps in electoral law in Ukraine. For example, the campaign financing rules, maybe some violations of these rules could become known to the public, but not yet. And for us to be sure that the election campaigns have been financed by the, so to say, clean money on which all the taxes have been levied and so on. We do not yet know whether all of the candidates were clean, so to say, in that respect. They didn't violate the campaign financing rules. Obvious also is are the attempts of different candidates to discredit each other. Like, for example, in case of Mr. Zelensky, he was accused, or the attempts were made to accuse him of some covert ties with the Russian Federation. Also, at the same time, some of the candidates were trying to diminish their own failures and their own shortcomings. For example, if before these hostilities of that started in 2014, any of the businessmen and candidates, now presidential candidates, they had some of their assets in Russian Federation. They had businesses, their own businesses there. Could it be used, and should it be used as a tool for discreditation? If we speak about the politicians who now are incumbent, members of the government, whether they should use these methods. It's it's an open question, and what's going to be the outcome of the runoff? It's difficult to say now. Certainly, obviously, the second most popular candidate will have difficulty in reaching the first place in the runoff. It's obvious, but again, the competitiveness of these elections, as we have seen in the first round, it's been in place, so to say. It has been obvious, and it will be certainly this competition will continue until the runoff. The existing majoritarian or majority vote system, it strengthens, practically fixes these opportunities for the incumbents to attract, for example, the people who are opportunistic, who would like to use the existing opportunities. And the old political teams of the old political candidates, they would probably continue using such people, but it may happen that the new politicians, so to say, might try to win over under the rules of this majority system. The question whether to modify somehow the existing electoral provisions, whether it is worthwhile to do that. Well, looking at the experience of and practices of the neighboring countries, we could we could draw our own conclusions. For example, we saw even before the first round of the vote, for example, the videos with the late President Reagan speaking with the voice of one of the Ukrainian presidential candidates, and so on. So our cooperation as of the members of our society should continue. Those who win and those who lose should continue to cooperate. That's one of the basic notions for any democratic society. And let us hope that this cooperation will continue not only at the level of slogans, but also at the level of specific programs. And I would like to thank here our colleagues. We managed to raise the interest to the programs of a number of candidates. My impression is that the public has paid more attention to these programs than in the previous elections or before the previous elections. And we have now two leading candidates who publicly stated the continuation of the existing political vector, so to say. I think that it's a matter of pride for us that the elections have been so far clean, without any major violations of electoral law. And let us hope that these gaps in legislation, for example, the financing of campaigns, of electoral campaigns, the violations of this last day, pre-election day ban on open political advertisement, they have been, these violations were minor, and I hope that with the improvement on our electoral legislation, especially in the realm of campaign financing, I hope that these gaps will be amended. Thank you very much for your expert opinion. And now we have the questions and answers session. If, dear guests, if you want to ask your questions, please introduce yourselves.
Якщо немає запитань,
If there are no questions, I, as a representative of the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, would ask you a question. As is well known, 95 Kvartal TV company has existed for many years. Their specialty was political satire, humor in politics, and can we view the continuation of this, line in political actions, or do you think it would all change? Well, what can I say? Political satire in Ukraine, the mere fact that it exists in Ukraine, is a positive sign. In my view, in some countries, in some other countries, it is next to non-existent. The other thing is how different people view this political satire. Some people try to criticize it as the something low level, artistic level, but at the same time. We can point out the real fact that political party with the name Sluga Narodu, which was also the title of the TV series in which Mr. Zelensky played the role of a president, the political party with this name was registered yet 2 years ago. But I'm certainly sure that I certainly doubt that the political party was registered under that name in order to just promote the TV series. So probably this is a sign of some intentions to go into politics. I cannot tell you who would benefit from that, because these attempts to point to Mr. Kolomoisky's interests, this is just a politically comfortable way of, setting this political or electoral process, because Kolomoisky himself didn't, so to say, play out this political party. His interests were in many political organizations and parties. He held negotiations with Ms. Tymoshenko, even the famous footballer Mr. Shevchenko, and it remains to be seen whether whether it has anything to do with he has anything to do with this political project. The other question that emerges in relation to this context is that we could see that the whole group of people whom we now see as closely linked or associated with Mr. Zelensky, who appear with him publicly, whether they are going to be the members of his team. So who would be those people working with him or around, who are going to be around him, helping him in formulating his political program, political agenda? I think that before the first real political decisions are taken, we will not be able to answer that question clearly. Any more questions? If there are none, then we... okay, there is one gentleman who would like to ask his question. Roman Beresha, TV channel Nash. Do you have any projections as to what the political forces who seem to have lost the first round of the elections, what they would be going to do? For example, the opposition candidates like Mr. Boyko, Mr. Vilkul, and the other candidates. Well, it's just, guessing out something out of the blue at this point in time. Let's wait until the parliamentary elections, because those political forces that have lost in the first round, they would be preparing themselves for the parliamentary vote. And I think, in my view, Mr. Ilko and the other candidates who, for example, are in favor of quick political settlement of the tense situation in the Donbass with the Russian Federation, negotiations with the Russian Federation to this. And I think that both those candidates who have not won and Mr. Zelensky himself, or rather those candidates vis-a-vis Mr. Zelensky, they might think that it might not be good for them to support Mr. Zelensky. But the negotiations that, for example, have been taking place, have been conducted between the Sluga Narodu party and the Batkivshchina party, the public information about these negotiations is a sign that the contacts between and among the political parties, they have been taking place, they continue, they are continuing. And it's obvious that Batkivshchina might try to even maybe go into court, trying to win that second place position in this presidential race. But I'm not sure whether it's going to be useful for them. And as for Mr. Zelensky, I think he positions himself as the new man, new type of a politician. Whether he would like to use the services, so to say, of the incumbent politicians, it's difficult to say. But for the politicians who are on the second and third places, especially Mr. Poroshenko's, who is still the president of the country, how seriously they might, attack or pursue the competitor. The competitor for the second place is, remains to be seen. For example, Mr. Sushko was one of the candidates who was tailing, so to say, following very closely those second and third most popular candidates. And there was a joke even about Mr. Nasirov's daughter, who said, who when asked whom she would vote for, she openly said that she would vote for Mr. Zelensky. So the further actions of minority candidates, if we look at their prospects, I think their support or lack of their support would not be critical and will not be critical for the second and third most popular candidates, especially for Mr. Poroshenko. But the intensity of the discussion and personal attacks that have taken place so far, they might limit, in my view, the opportunities for their cooperation, for the cooperation of those minor candidates. The teams, I agree with that. The teams of some of the candidates were trying to discredit each other, attacking each other. Mudslinging was quite widely used. But in my view, that all is to say that they would not play any significant role in the outcome of the runoff.
Presenting here the European movement, Finland, and I suppose there is no other representative of European Movement International here. I'm also a member of the political committee Europe in the World of the European Movement International, and it sort of handles with Eastern neighborhood policies and so on. So I'm very proud to be here, and I congratulate you on these non-rigged fair elections. And you must always remember that we must not think that the presidential elections are so important, because the parliament, at least we have you have said rightly that the parliament, in Finland also we have the same problem. But I would like to ask a question. Did you notice any kind of Russian influence or trying to influence the voting, or some kind of a disturbance? Because I was living in a hotel Ukraine, and yesterday we had a bomb sort of a threat there, and we have to all evacuate ourselves. And at the same time there was in Tallinn 4 different cases, and same time also in Finland we have parliamentary elections in Finland in in 2 weeks' time. And for the first time in Finnish, we are very sort of a peaceful people, and now there have been attacks against some candidates, and violent attacks, and it's first time in our history. So I sort of think that this is a sort of a game from the Putin side, that they would like to attack all the democratic forces in Europe. What is your conception on this? Thank you.
Well, I think the main task for Putin actually is to discredit the whole process in Ukraine, what's going on in Ukraine. So it's very important for Putin to delegitimize Ukrainian authorities, to destabilize the country, to show that Ukraine is a failed state, as they would like to depict, and to show that Ukrainians are not they are not able to conduct democratic elections. So this is the basic general line. And I would say that mostly we can say that the Russian influence, as for me, it's actually the most visible in social media by manipulation, by indirect. It's not open, but they are using the rules of democracy in order to undermine democracy. Okay, so the usual tactics for dictators, okay? This is first thing. The second thing is that openly pro-Russian candidate didn't have a chances to win in Ukrainian elections. But what they did on the eve of elections, one of pro-Russian candidates, Mr. Boyko, he visited Kremlin and he met with Medvedev and Miller, I guess. So, and it was clear demonstration of support, and the idea was to increase the vote for Boyko. And by the way, coming to your question, there is a strong competition between Boyko and Vilkul. And Vilkul, I would say, is more oriented towards working within Ukrainian political system. So it's important for Mr. Akhmetov, who is controlling Vilkul, to increase the chances by Vilkul in parliamentary elections. While Putin, what Putin is doing, actually he tried to help Boyko to increase his influence. So this is the second. And finally, the third thing is definitely what Putin openly said actually half a year before elections, that he will not negotiate with current president of Ukraine. He openly stated that, and this was a clear message that for him it's really important that Poroshenko would not win elections even from symbolic point of view. And Putin is waiting for not only for results of the presidential elections, but also for results for parliamentary elections, because he thinks that with the new composition of Ukrainian parliament, Ukrainian government, it would be easy for him to get concessions concessions, especially regarding Crimea and regarding Donbass. And here we come to the danger that again he may play around inexperience of Mr. Zelensky and his team.
Ще запитання, колеги? Якщо запитань більше немає, то ми маємо трохи часу перед початком наступного брифінгу. Можете записати коментарі.
If there are no more questions, you have some time to record maybe some of the interviews with the political experts that you could use in your TV programs.